In the summer of 1940, American newspapers were confident to the point of arrogance. Across the United States, headlines declared that Britain was finished, that the island nation was exhausted, isolated, and living on borrowed time. Editorials predicted collapse. Columnists spoke openly about inevitability. The British Empire, they said, had finally reached its breaking point. Nazi Germany had conquered Poland in weeks. Norway fell. Denmark fell. Belgium folded. The Netherlands collapsed. And France, the pride of Europe, was humiliated in just 6 weeks. If France could fall that quickly, Britain didn't stand a chance. From New York to Chicago to Los Angeles, the consensus was clear. Britain would not survive the year. America, still neutral, watched from across the Atlantic with a mixture of fascination and detachment. Many Americans believed Europe's problems were Europe's own fault. Isolationism was strong. Memories of the First World War were still raw. And now, with Germany unstoppable on land, Britain looked like the next domino. Newspapers described the Royal Air Force as outdated. Its pilots were portrayed as brave but doomed. Its aircraft were dismissed as inferior to Germany's modern war machine. The Luftwaffe, fresh from victory after victory, was described as the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. According to American analysts, once Germany turned its full attention to Britain, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. But what those newspapers failed to understand, what almost everyone outside Britain failed to understand, was that the coming battle would not be decided by numbers alone, or by reputation, or by what had worked in previous wars. The Battle of Britain would be fought in the air, over cities, coastlines, and countryside, in a new kind of conflict, where technology, intelligence, and human endurance mattered more than sheer force. And, when it finally came, the Royal Air Force would do something no one thought possible. It would not just survive, it would humiliate the Luftwaffe, and in doing so, shatter the myth of Nazi invincibility. After France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind tanks, artillery, and equipment. The German army stood across the Channel, preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But before German troops could land on British beaches, the Luftwaffe had to gain control of the skies. That was non-negotiable. Hitler himself understood this. Without air superiority, an invasion would be suicide. The task fell to Hermann Göring and his Luftwaffe, an air force that believed itself unstoppable. On paper, the numbers looked grim for Britain. The Luftwaffe had more aircraft, more bombers, more experienced crews who had already fought and won over Europe. German pilots were veterans of Poland, Norway, and France. The RAF, by contrast, was short on pilots and planes. British factories were working around the clock, but losses were mounting. And yet, hidden beneath the surface, Britain possessed advantages that the German high command either underestimated or misunderstood. The first advantage was geography. Britain was fighting over its own territory. RAF pilots who were shot down could parachute into friendly territory and fly again the next day. German pilots who bailed out were either captured or drowned in the Channel. Every German loss was permanent. Every British loss might be temporary. The second advantage was intelligence. Britain had built a revolutionary air defense system that tied together radar stations, observer corps, command centers, and fighter squadrons into a single coordinated network. Radar, still new and poorly understood by Germany, gave Britain early warning of incoming raids. RAF fighters didn't have to patrol blindly. They could wait on the ground until German bombers were detected, then scramble at the perfect moment. This conserved fuel, preserved aircraft, and maximized efficiency. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, flew long missions from bases in France and Belgium, often at the limit of their range. The third advantage was leadership and doctrine. While Germany emphasized offensive power and massed bomber formations, Britain focused on defense, coordination, and precision interception. RAF Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, resisted pressure to throw everything into reckless attacks. Instead, he insisted on conserving strength, rotating pilots, and keeping squadrons intact. At the time, critics accused him of being too cautious. In hindsight, his approach saved Britain. When the air campaign began in earnest in July 1940, American observers expected the RAF to be overwhelmed within weeks. German bombers targeted shipping in the Channel, then radar stations along the coast. But the radar towers refused to stay down. British engineers repaired them within hours. The Luftwaffe never fully grasped how vital radar was to Britain's defense, nor how resilient the system truly was. They believed they were blinding the RAF, when in reality they were barely scratching the surface. As August arrived, the attacks intensified. German bombers escorted by fighters crossed the Channel in massive formations. The skies over southern England filled with contrails, engine noise, and smoke. Day after day, RAF pilots scrambled to intercept, climbing into the sun, diving into combat, firing until their guns jammed or ammunition ran dry. Losses were heavy on both sides. British airfields were bombed, hangars burned, runways were cratered. At moments, the situation seemed desperate. American newspapers reported these developments with grim satisfaction. Headlines spoke of Britain's last stand. Commentators claimed the RAF was bleeding itself to death. Some even speculated about evacuation plans for the British government. The idea that Britain could actually win the air battle was rarely entertained. But the Luftwaffe was making critical mistakes. German intelligence consistently overestimated RAF losses and underestimated British aircraft production. German pilots reported seeing planes shot down, unaware that many were damaged but repaired and flying again within days. Meanwhile, British factories were producing fighters faster than Germany realized. And just as important, British pilots were learning. Tactics improved, coordination sharpened, squadrons gained experience and confidence. Then came the turning point, one born not of strategy but of error. In late August, German bombers accidentally dropped their payloads on London. Until then, the Luftwaffe had focused on airfields and infrastructure. Britain responded with a retaliatory raid on Berlin, small in scale but enormous in psychological impact. Hitler was furious, Goering was embarrassed, and in a moment of anger and pride, Germany changed strategy. Instead of continuing to target RAF airfields, which were under immense strain, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus to bombing British cities. London became the primary target. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, waves of bombers attacked civilian areas, hoping to break British morale and force surrender. American newspapers interpreted this as the beginning of the end. Surely, they said, no nation could endure such punishment. But the shift saved the RAF. Airfields had time to recover. Pilots had time to rest. Aircraft were repaired and replaced. And as German bombers flew deeper inland, they stretched their fighter escorts beyond effective range. RAF fighters could now attack bombers with less interference, inflicting devastating losses. The psychological effect was the opposite of what Germany intended. Instead of breaking British morale, the bombing hardened it. Londoners slept in shelters, returned to work the next morning, and carried on. The RAF became a symbol of national defiance. Pilots, many barely out of their teens, were celebrated as heroes. The phrase, "never was so much owed by so many to so few," captured the moment. By September, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Losses mounted. Experienced crews were killed or captured. Aircraft production could not keep pace with attrition. German pilots began to realize they were not winning. The RAF was still there, still fighting, still intercepting. The invasion of Britain was postponed. Then, quietly shelved. For American journalists, the reality was impossible to ignore. Britain had not fallen. Instead, the supposedly inferior Air Force had stopped Germany cold. For the first time in the war, Hitler had been defeated, not on land, not at sea, but in the air. The humiliation was profound. Goering, once boastful and arrogant, was forced onto the defensive. The Luftwaffe's reputation suffered irreparable damage. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and across the Atlantic, American opinion began to shift. Britain was no longer seen as a doomed relic of the past, but as a resilient ally worth supporting. The Battle of Britain did more than save an island. It changed the course of the war. It ensured Britain would remain a base for future Allied operations. It preserved a front from which Europe could one day be liberated. And it demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be resisted and beaten. American newspapers that once predicted Britain's collapse now printed stories of courage and endurance. The tone changed. Respect replaced condescension. And slowly, inevitably, the United States moved closer to involvement. In the end, the RAF didn't just survive. It exposed the limits of Nazi power. It humiliated the Luftwaffe in front of the world. And it proved that determination, preparation, and belief could overcome even the most terrifying war machine ever assembled. What began as a confident prediction of Britain's fall ended as a lesson in humility for Germany and for those who underestimated the island nation that refused to surrender.